Hello, I trust you are well. I am Peter Kirby, staff writer at Activist Post and author of the book Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project. Those of us with eyes to see and a mind to understand have been seeing the chemtrails in the skies above us for many years now. Although we have seen more than enough, the deepest of understandings are only now coming into focus. When we started unraveling this thing, we knew that we were being sprayed. The obvious particulate emissions from the aircraft, coupled with early rainwater test sample results, showed us that much. There were people calling themselves geoengineers who proposed such activities. But the real who, what, when, where, why, and how of this story largely remained a mystery. Over the course of many years, researchers and activists, including your author, have tenaciously clawed away at this story, and their efforts have produced a much clearer picture. Although there are many important agendas at play, the main thrust of geoengineering is weather modification. Weather modification is the ancient motive that has compelled the development and production of today's geoengineering programs throughout the decades. More sophisticated motives, such as mind control, beam weaponry, genetic modification, and those related to the smart grid, evolved later. This video covers significant developments in the history of what the author refers to as the New Manhattan Project. For a full explanation of this project, as well as an explanation of why the author has drawn a parallel to the original Manhattan Project, one should read the new edition of the author's book. The greatly revised and expanded second edition of Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project, is available now exclusively at Amazon.com. There is a link to the webpage where one may purchase the book in the description below. For now, let us begin. The earliest origins of the New Manhattan Project are found in the late 1800s with the great inventor Nikola Tesla. Tesla's work in atmospheric electricity and weather modification pioneered the areas of study most central to today's New Manhattan Project. As Tesla was tinkering and hypothesizing, some of the most powerful men in the Western world were forming an organization that would go on to propel the New Manhattan Project throughout the decades. In 1888, something called the Society of the Elect was formed by Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes was mainly funded by the Rothschild family, and he made his fortune exploiting Africa's natural resources. The Society of the Elect's main purpose was to chart a course of events that would culminate in what its members called a new world order. Upon Rhodes's death in 1902, the Society of the Elect changed its name to the Round Table. Evidence indicates that this Round Table, offshoots of this group, and Round Table members making up a cabal of Western financial powers, have been responsible for propelling the New Manhattan Project throughout the decades. Also in the late 1800s, Other scientific work conducted by Sweden's most famous scientist, Svante Arrhenius, was being conducted. Arrhenius's theory of man-made global warming has been and continues to be used as a means of propelling the new Manhattan Project. Arrhenius first concocted the theory in late 1894 and continued work on it in 1895. Arrhenius had his first paper on the topic published in very late 1895. So the theory of man-made global warming largely became known to the public in early 1896. This timeline is important because it was exactly 100 years later, in 1996, when large-scale American domestic spraying operations began. You see, the theory of man-made global warming has served as the problem to which we are obliged to find a solution. The solution that has been continually put forward is that of weather modification, or as today's geoengineers call it, climate modification. Arrhenius was deeply involved in the atmospheric sciences, and one of his closest associates, Wilhelm Bjerknes, is the father of atmospheric modeling. In 1912, something called the Research Corporation was founded. This is significant because it appears that the Research Corporation, known today as the Research Corporation for Science Advancement, has been producing lots of basic scientific studies which have been used in support of the new Manhattan Project. In the mid-1930s, the Research Corporation and the Smithsonian went on to sponsor pioneering research into the field of coal fly ash utilization. We concern ourselves with the field of coal fly ash utilization because today's most common chemtrail spray has been scientifically determined to be coal fly ash. Also in the 1930s, a man by the name of Alfred Lee Loomis was experimenting with human brain waves. This is significant to our investigation because today's ionospheric heaters, which control the weather as part of the new Manhattan Project, operate in the same frequency ranges as those that can control the human mind. Alfred Lee Loomis has many other compelling connections to the early development of the new Manhattan Project. With the coming of America's involvement in World War II, developments relevant to the new Manhattan Project greatly accelerated. In Asia, the Flying Tigers were formed. This is significant because the Flying Tigers were most probably the beginnings of today's proprietary chemtrail fleet. Back in America, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory developed technology important to the new Manhattan Project. Specifically, the MIT RAD Lab developed an early precursor of today's ionospheric heaters known as LORAN. The RAD Lab also developed early air traffic control technology utilizing radar. In 1943, also during the war, the aforementioned Nikola Tesla died, and his effects were confiscated by the United States government. These documents and other items seized by the government may have included detailed plans for a large-scale weather modification program in the vein of today's New Manhattan Project. Later in the war, as the Allies approached a victory in Europe, they captured lots of German technology. This captured technology, specifically aerospace technology, was to become important to the development of the New Manhattan Project. In fact, former Nazi scientists came along with the captured technology as part of something called Operation Paperclip. As it became clear who the winners and losers of World War II would be, in 1943, the Rockefellers and the Council on Foreign Relations secretly drew up plans for the United Nations. Finally established in 1945, evidence indicates that the United Nations has played a central role in the development, production, and execution of the New Manhattan Project. Lots of developments occurred immediately after World War II as well. When the war in the Pacific Theater ended with Japan's surrender, an airline called Civil Air Transport rose from the ashes of the aforementioned Flying Tigers. As we continue our story, we will see that Civil Air Transport was most probably another phase in the development of today's proprietary chemtrail fleet. Also, with the end of World War II, an airplane manufacturer in America called the Texas Engineering and Manufacturing Company was founded. Evidence indicates that the Texas Engineering and Manufacturing Company, known as TEMCO, would go on to play a central role in the development of what the author calls the dual-purpose chemtrail fleet. Evidence indicates that TEMCO was the company that began operations relevant to the retrofitting of commercial aircraft, retrofitting that allows such aircraft to participate in domestic chemtrail spraying operations. An important high-profile scientific paper titled Outline of Weather Proposal also appeared immediately following World War II. Among other suggestions, Outline of Weather Proposal proposed a global weather modification project. Shortly after the war, in 1946, more post-war plans for the New Manhattan Project were being laid. In May of 1946, a series of reports titled Toward New Horizons had a restricted release. The Toward New Horizons reports were a product of analyzing captured German aerospace technology, and these reports set the course of America's research and development activities in military aerospace for many years to come. The reports touched on many areas relevant to the New Manhattan Project, as they suggested a new era of peacetime weather control. It is interesting to note that these reports came out exactly 50 years before the 1996 release of a similarly themed set of documents known as Air Force 2025, which contained the infamous Owning the Weather in 2025 report. Also in May of 1946, at Princeton University, the famous Manhattan Project scientist John von Neumann began his meteorology project at the Institute for Advanced Studies. Von Neumann's meteorology project laid the foundations of today's computerized weather modeling programs. Pertaining to the roots of the new Manhattan Project, what the public mostly saw in 1946 was three scientists from General Electric touting a new era in weather modification. Irving Langmuir, Vincent Schaefer, and Bernard Vonnegut were celebrated in the press for dumping dry ice out of an airplane, causing cumulus clouds to produce precipitation. It was only a few months later that they were dumping more questionable substances out of aircraft in attempts to modify the weather. But by that time, the media had turned their attention elsewhere. Lastly, in 1946, the Rockefellers were positioning themselves to profit from a new era in military aerospace technology. That year, Lawrence Rockefeller founded Rockefeller Brothers Incorporated as a venture capital investment firm. Rockefeller Brothers Incorporated went on to invest in cutting-edge technologies relevant to the new Manhattan Project, such as jet airplanes, rockets, aviation electronics, and nuclear research. It was also around this time that the Central Intelligence Agency was coming into being. Evidence indicates that the CIA has been most central to the development, production, and execution of all aspects of the new Manhattan Project. In fact, evidence indicates that the CIA is the day-to-day overall manager of the entire project and has been since its inception. In 1947, a group of former Nazi scientists brought to America as part of the aforementioned Operation Paperclip launched their first rocket at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. This group of rocket scientists was headed by the famous Wernher von Braun, and their work is relevant to the new Manhattan Project in that the rockets that they developed were used in atmospheric sounding experiments designed to better understand our atmosphere. In 1950, this von Braun rocket group was moved to Huntsville, Alabama, where, 5 years after that, they all became American citizens. In 1950, something called Project Charles began. Project Charles was the beginning of something called the SAGE system, which involved the mass remote control of aircraft by a central computer. This type of air traffic control system is central to today's new Manhattan Project. Project Charles and the SAGE system eventually gave rise to the 1958 creation of the MITRE Corporation, which is most probably the day-to-day manager of all the scientific aspects of today's new Manhattan Project. It was also in the year of 1950 that the CIA officially became involved in the operations of the aforementioned civil air transport. The agency brought in their man, George A. Duell, who quickly created something called Air America to handle clandestine activities, while giving civil air transport the commercial aviation work. Duell created many other airlines, which were collectively known as Air America. All these airlines were organized under Duell's creation, known as the Pacific Corporation. In 1951, the National Science Foundation was created. This is significant because the National Science Foundation, over the years, has provided lots of funding for scientific activities relevant to the atmospheric sciences and weather modification. In 1952, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory was established in Livermore, California. This is important to our discussion because Lawrence Livermore Laboratory has historically been at the forefront of computerized atmospheric modeling. It is also very interesting to understand that years earlier, the Rockefellers and their Standard Oil Company provided the funding for the initial development of the lab. Beginning in 1955, a former General Electric scientist named Bernard Vonnegut began conducting space charge experiments. Vonnegut was one of the GE scientists who, as previously mentioned in 1946, made a big public splash during the rollout of a new era in weather modification. Vonnegut conducted these space charge experiments with his longtime colleague, Charles Moore. Space charge experiments involved the charging, or ionization, of atmospheric particles. The charged atmospheric particles were then measured downwind. Vonnegut and Moore's early space charge experiments involved the ionization of ambient atmospheric particles, while later experiments involved the generation and disbursement of man-made atmospheric particles. Their experiments in this area culminated in the late 1960s with experiments in New Mexico involving a large charged particle generator known as Stirling's cloud machine. In 1955, a seminal paper by John von Neumann titled "Can We Survive Technology?" appeared in the pages of Fortune magazine. This paper is significant because it contained the first significant mention of the solar radiation management geoengineering thesis, and because it kicked off the modern era of the theory of man-made global warming. The paper gave an excuse for the creation of vast bureaucracies, as well as hundreds of millions of dollars in spending, all directed towards saving the Earth from the scourge of man-made climate change. The paper created an excuse for spending hundreds of millions of dollars on the New Manhattan Project. In 1957, the military-industrial academic complex was given further reason to expand when the Russians successfully launched the first satellite to orbit the globe. The Department of Defense sounded an alarm of U.S. technological inferiority, and the American taxpayer was compelled to increase military spending. Sputnik helped make more money available for the New Manhattan Project. In 1958, one of the most cited weather modification reports ever was published. The title of this report was the final report of the Advisory Committee on Weather Control. Among the papers published in this report was one written by our friend Bernard Vonnegut and co-authors titled "The Future," which outlined an atmosphere saturated with, quote, chemicals and the, quote, altering of atmospheric electricity. Does that sound familiar? Also in 1958, nuclear bombs were detonated in the atmosphere as part of a program that went by the name of Operation Argus. These atmospheric nuclear explosions were performed in order to map the Earth's magnetic field. These operations were pertinent to the New Manhattan Project because they were designed to give us a better understanding of our atmosphere. Thanks to Sputnik, 1958 was a big year. 1958 was also the beginning of operations at Clam Lake, straddling the state lines of Wisconsin and Michigan. The extensive facilities at Clam Lake were used to conduct experiments in the ELF and VLF frequency ranges, which probably involved early electromagnetic weather modification experiments. As mentioned a little earlier, 1958 also saw the creation of the MITRE Corporation. Not only that, but the Advanced Research Projects Agency was also founded in 1958. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, later known as the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, has apparently been executively organizing the scientific aspects of the New Manhattan Project, just above the MITRE Corporation. Lastly, in 1958, an important former Nazi meteorologist by the name of Hans Dolzalek was brought to America and subsequently accepted a job with the Aviation Corporation of America. Dolzalek is of particular interest to our investigation because he is an expert in atmospheric electricity, an area of direct relevance to the New Manhattan Project. Dolzalek's fellow former Nazis in the von Braun rocket group, who had entered America earlier as part of Operation Paperclip, in 1960 were transferred to the newly created National Aeronautics and Space Administration. There, they were instrumental in building and firing the massive rockets designed to send the first man to the moon. In related activities, 1959 saw the first meteorological instrument launched into space aboard the Vanguard 2 satellite. The first dedicated meteorological satellite, known as the TIROS-1, was launched in 1960. Also in 1960, the University of Chicago first applied the use of radar to weather modification activities. In 1960 as well, the JASON study group began meeting. There is lots of evidence that the extremely capable scientists of the JASON group have contributed greatly to the development and production of the New Manhattan Project. In other developments, it was also in 1960 that the aforementioned TEMCO merged with an electronics company called Ling Alltech to form Ling TEMCO. A year later, Ling TEMCO absorbed the Chance Vought Corporation to form Ling TEMCO Vought. Subsequently, a company called LTV Electro Systems was spun off. This LTV Electro Systems contracted for the United States Air Force in the repair, overhaul, and modification of aircraft. LTV Electro Systems also went on, under a different name, to build the first version of HARP. In 1961, the CIA was operating over-the-horizon radar facilities in Pakistan. They operated updated over-the-horizon radar facilities later in Taiwan. This is significant because over-the-horizon radar is the precursor to today's ionospheric heaters, which modify the weather as part of the New Manhattan Project. Also in 1961, an important paper by Bernard Vonnegut was published, titled Research in Electrical Phenomena Associated with Aerosols. This paper was about how charged atmospheric particles can be used as a transmission medium to deliver electromagnetic energy to people's brains. Considering Vonnegut's previous work in the field of charged atmospheric particles and weather modification, this paper is particularly relevant here. It was also in 1961 that President Kennedy spoke in favor of global weather control before the United Nations. In 1962, an important paper by Yale Mintz et al., titled A New Rational Approach to Weather Control Research, outlined methods of, quote, altering individual weather systems through the introduction of artificial energy sources directly into the atmosphere, unquote. The document goes on to describe how these injections of man-made electromagnetic energy can be simulated in computer models in order to predict the results. This type of activity is what today's geoengineers do in order to predict the outcomes of their weather modification activities. It was in 1963 that a Navy Vice Admiral by the name of William Francis Raborn began to merit our attention. In that year, Vice Admiral Raborn's paper titled New Horizons of Naval Research was published. Raborn's paper spoke to new, powerful, and comprehensive weather control efforts involving the use of electromagnetic energy. It was the most explicit description of the New Manhattan Project to date. In that same year of 1963, the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology was created. The CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology went on to pioneer over-the-horizon radar technology as well as remote sensing satellites, two areas with meaningful implications for the New Manhattan Project. It was only fitting, then, that Vice Admiral Raborn became the head of the CIA 2 years later, in 1965. During Raborn's brief reign as head of the CIA, an important report titled Restoring the Quality of Our Environment came out of the LBJ White House. Restoring the quality of our environment is significant because it was the first executive branch document to state that man-made climate change was a problem. The authors of the document also advocated for the solution to the problem. The authors of Restoring the Quality of Our Environment advocated for solar radiation management geoengineering. 5 years later, Raborn took a seat on the LTV Electrosystems Board of Directors. Meanwhile, at Pennsylvania State University, in 1966, the earliest known ionospheric heater had been created. Also in 1966, efforts towards the large-scale monetization of the effects of weather modification activities had begun. In that year, a paper by James Hibbs titled Evaluation of Weather and Climate by Socio-Economic Sensitivity Indices was published. This paper outlined a method of assigning a set of values to different economic activities and conducting weather control operations based on those values. 3 years later, in 1969, James McQuigg of the University of Missouri had written and published two highly relevant papers. The first one, published in April, was titled "A Simulation Model for Studying Possible Modification of Surface Temperature," and it told us that temperature modification could be accomplished by the generation of contrail cirrus from jet aircraft. In late 1969, in a paper titled "Temperature Modification and Costs of Electric Power Generation," McQuigg and two co-authors laid the foundations of the modern weather derivatives market by fusing the nascent field of atmospheric temperature modification with the generation of electrical power. McQuigg went on later to invent the degree day method of determining the value of temperature-based weather derivatives contracts. You see, the weather derivatives market, which continues to this day, was founded by Enron in the mid-1990s, right around the time that large-scale domestic spraying operations began. Although the weather derivatives market allows for wagering on a broad range of geophysical phenomena, temperature-based weather derivatives are by far the most popular. Temperature-based weather derivatives have direct relevance to the energy sector because people use or don't use different types of energy depending on atmospheric temperature. In 1968, a highly relevant paper by a highly relevant scientist was published. The paper was titled "How to Wreck the Environment," and its author was Dr. Gordon J.F. MacDonald. How to Wreck the Environment was relevant to the New Manhattan Project in that it was a masterpiece of geophysical warfare as it spoke to remote mind control and extreme weather. The paper's author, Gordon J.F. MacDonald, had copious connections to the New Manhattan Project, including extensive business relations with the MITRE Corporation as well as the CIA. In 1972, LTV Electrosystems was bought and taken private. The company subsequently changed its name to E-Systems, and this is the name they were going under at the time that they completed the first version of HAARP many years later. Also in the early 1970s, the Rockefellers were cranking up the modern environmental movement. They planned, promoted, and funded the first Earth Day in 1970. 2 years earlier, at David Rockefeller's estate in Bellagio, Italy, the Club of Rome had been created as a think tank for this brand of so-called environmentalism. Less than 3 months after the first Earth Day, under the guidance of Henry Kissinger, the Environmental Protection Agency was created. It was this Rockefeller environmental movement that soon began stressing the importance of the theory of man-made global climate change, the excuse for the New Manhattan Project. The Rockefellers went on to use their United Nations as the vehicle for modern environmentalism. In 1972, they funded the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, Sweden. A trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation by the name of Maurice Strong led the conference. The United Nations Environment Program was designated as the agency that was to manage all the world's resources. This agency was subsequently created, and Maurice Strong became the chairman. The United Nations Environment Program then began issuing news releases about, among other things, the pollution of the air by carbon emissions. Also in 1972, in association with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Club of Rome issued a report titled The Limits to Growth. The Limits to Growth characterizes man's emissions of atmospheric carbon dioxide as problematic because they say that such emissions could cause Earth's climate to change. During all of this, the Bush family was apparently paying attention and thinking ahead. In 1972, a company owned by members of the Bush family called Dresser Industries acquired another company called Lodge-Cottrell. Lodge-Cottrell was the leader in the field of electrostatic precipitators, which remove coal fly ash from the smokestacks of coal-fired electrical power plants. As we already know, coal fly ash is the most common chemtrail spray. It was also in the early 1970s that ionospheric heater operations were picking up at a place called Poker Flat in Alaska. Among early ionospheric heaters at Poker Flat was the aforementioned first known ionospheric heater developed at Pennsylvania State, as well as another developed at Stanford University. In 1974, the CIA released their report, A Study of Climatological Research as it Pertains to Intelligence Problems. The report went on and on about all the horrible things that can happen to our planet and our species when the Earth's average temperature fluctuates. All of this, of course, was due to man's atmospheric carbon emissions. Again, they were making a case for the New Manhattan Project in that a global weather control program could save us from all this. Back to the real world for a moment. Also in 1974, the aforementioned Air America was disbanded, and the next year, Evergreen Aviation bought one of the airlines formerly under the Pacific Corporation, known as Intermountain. This Intermountain acquisition included extensive world-class airplane repair facilities in Arizona, where Evergreen may very well have participated in the generation of the chemtrail-spraying aircraft of the New Manhattan Project. Another deal resulting from the disbandment of Air America was E-Systems' acquisition of another company under the Pacific Corporation known as Air Asia. Air Asia came complete with other world-class aviation repair facilities in Taiwan, which also may have participated in the production of the chemtrail aircraft of the New Manhattan Project. In 1977, a paper by Cesar Marchetti titled On Geoengineering and the CO2 Problem was published in the first edition of a publication called Climatic Change. This was the first use of the term geoengineering. Also in 1977, a Rhodes Scholar and member of the Council on Foreign Relations by the name of Harland Cleveland testified before the United States House of Representatives about a new method of weather modification involving electromagnetic energy. A longtime proponent of the theory of man-made climate change as well as global weather modification, Cleveland was connected to the highest levels of world power and appears to have been instrumental in the production and development of the New Manhattan Project. In 1978, the most significant of overt international programs in the atmospheric sciences was conducted. It was called the first GARP Global Experiment and involved a slew of top-level scientific organizations from many countries. By 1978, the CIA had developed a psychotronic weapon capable of being bounced off of the ionosphere to affect large, densely populated areas thousands of miles away. This was known as Operation Peak. Evidence indicates that today's proprietary chemtrail fleet went into the production phase beginning in about 1980. By this time, it appears that the bulk of the basic science needed to produce the New Manhattan Project had already been done. It was also around this time that aerospace industry participants experienced a sudden dearth of available facilities, equipment, and manpower. Lastly, it was in the early 1980s that black budgets went through the roof. In 1980, the most significant ionospheric heater short of the HAARP antenna began to be constructed in Alaska. Known as the High-Pass ionospheric heater, it was located at Two Rivers near Fairbanks. Construction was completed in 1986. Also in 1980, a scientist by the name of Dr. Michael Persinger published a book titled The Weather Matrix and Human Behavior. The weather matrix and human behavior pertains to the human psychological and physiological effects of natural ELF and VLF fields, as well as the physiological effects of ionized particles. As we know that the New Manhattan Project utilizes frequencies in these ranges as well as ionized particles, information in the weather matrix and human behavior can be applied to this global weather modification project. In 1985, the aforementioned Aviation Corporation of America was acquired by a company called Textron. The Aviation Corporation of America was the company where the former Nazi meteorologist Hans Dolzalik, along with at least one other famous former Nazi, went after coming to America. With this acquisition, Textron nearly doubled in size. The Aviation Corporation of America became a division of Textron known as Textron Defense Systems. The 1988 U.S. patent Selective Thermal Radiators by David B. Chang and a co-author describes how a mass of small atmospheric particles can be energized like the mantle of a modern gas lantern. This effect was more explicitly described in Chang's later stratospheric Welsbach seeding for reduction of global warming patent. What Chang describes is what happens when the electromagnetic energy from an ionospheric heater hits an atmosphere saturated by chemtrail spray. This so-called Welsbach effect can be used to modify the weather. Also of note in Chang's Welsbach seeding patent is the fact that he mentions that jet fuels might be spiked with aluminum in order to produce more atmospheric particles from jet engine exhausts. This is made all the more interesting by the fact that around this same time, a UC San Diego professor by the name of Stanford Solomon Penner wrote of a, quote, jet fuel coal mixture, unquote, designed to do the same thing. In 1988, the Rockefellers' climate agenda was taken to the United States Senate. There, a formerly obscure NASA scientist testified that he was sure that the Earth was headed for a climate disaster due to man's emissions of atmospheric carbon dioxide. 1988 was also the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is a United Nations organization designed to provide a scientific basis for the theory of man-made global warming. The scientific thing to do would actually be to attempt to disprove the theory, but never mind that. The Rockefellers have an agenda here. 2 years later, in 1991, two top-ranking members of the aforementioned Club of Rome published a book titled The First Global Revolution, in which the authors admitted that they had concocted and promoted the threat of global warming. The Rockefellers then continued to promote their solutions to the problem of global warming throughout the first half of the 1990s with their UN Conference on Environment and Development held in Rio de Janeiro and their Conference of the Parties, the first of which was held in Berlin. Also in the early 1990s, the Accelerated Strategic Computing Initiative at Lawrence Livermore National Labs began operating. After a long history of computerized atmospheric modeling at Livermore Labs, this was the effort that was finally capable of providing for the needs of the modern New Manhattan Project. In the early 1990s, ionospheric heater developments were also running hot and heavy. First, a couple of patents emerged detailing how aircraft can be remotely powered in flight by ground-based ionospheric heaters. The first one, assigned to the Rockefellers' Arco Power Technologies, was titled Power Beaming System and was granted in 1991. One of the inventors listed on Power Beaming System was Peter Coert. Coert was also listed as a co-inventor of the 1993 patent titled Power Beaming System with Printer Circuit Radiating Elements having Resonating Cavities, which also described a system of remotely powering aircraft. These patents, along with other information, provide evidence for the notion that the proprietary aircraft of the New Manhattan Project are remotely powered. In 1993, construction began on what was at the time the world's most powerful and versatile ionospheric heater, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program antenna in Alaska. The aforementioned E-Systems completed the HAARP antenna in 1995. Once they were done, E-Systems modified their name to Raytheon E-Systems. In 1992, insurance catastrophe futures contracts began trading on the Chicago Board of Trade. These futures contracts allowed investors to wager on extreme weather events such as hurricanes and tornadoes, events which could conceivably be caused by the New Manhattan Project and ionospheric heaters such as HAARP. As we approached the beginning of large-scale domestic chemtrail spraying operations, in 1992, the Bush family's Carlyle Group bought a portion of the aforementioned Ling-Temco Vought. Now the Bush family and the Rockefellers were finally fully invested and ready to get busy. In 1996, the same year that large-scale domestic spraying operations began, the Air Force released a series of documents titled Air Force 2025, As previously noted, this set of documents was released exactly 50 years after the Toward New Horizons documents. Air Force 2025 outlined the New Manhattan Project multiple times, contained the infamous Owning the Weather 2025 report, and set forth a series of future objectives for the Air Force. At the time of Air Force 2025's release, at least one of these objectives was already operational. Since 1996, we have been assaulted almost every day by this New Manhattan Project. They are dumping tens of thousands of megatons of toxic waste into our atmosphere annually. This video is designed to better inform the public about these crimes against humanity so that we may be able to end the spraying. What has been provided here is a rough outline of the information provided in my book. For the complete story, please read the greatly revised and expanded second edition of my book, Chemtrails Exposed, A New Manhattan Project, available now exclusively at Amazon.com. Also, for all the latest developments, please subscribe to my email list at my website, peterakirby.com. Thank you.